Welcome! Today is the day where I show you my whole coloring process of this Final Fantasy fan art with Yuna and Tidus. We're starting off with having a look at my color scheme for this piece. Color studies can be quite time consuming. I think I spent perhaps 1 hour figuring out what colors I was going to use. But in the long run, it actually saves you a lot of time. And that's because if you do this beforehand and really plan out what colors you are going to use, you can avoid mistakes that come from picking a color that doesn't match the other one you wanted to use, or you might want to use a color as a shadow, and then once you try it, you might see that it doesn't work, and then you can't undo it. And believe me, this is something I learned the hard way. I've been doing so many mistakes with colors that don't match together. When you use Copic markers, the colors are actually belonging to a color family. So for instance, you have the yellow colors, and you have the yellow red, and you have the yellow green. So they have like different hues that you can play with. And perhaps you pick just a color from the yellow family, and you want to make a shadow using a color from the yellow-red family. And then if you don't test that out beforehand, they might not blend nicely. So that's definitely something I learned the hard way, and since that I've almost always been doing color studies before I start coloring. Another thing that is really great with color studies is that you can go back to them and find out what colors you used for a specific piece. So, for instance, I have done some Copic pieces of some one-shot fan art, and for a specific piece I was very satisfied with the colors I picked. And I was lucky because I didn't throw away the color study. So because I kept it, I could go back to that and use the same color scheme for my newer piece. So that's another way in which color studies can really help you out. I also think it's a little cool to have your color schemes next to a finished artwork, to really like see all that planning and all that work that went into it, and just to get a feel for what colors we used. So in the video right now I am coloring the skin of Tidus, and I just finished Yuna's skin. As you can see, I use some blue, violet and violet colors to shade the skin. And this is also something I learned quite recently, or perhaps 2 years back now. And that is that to achieve a natural looking shadow on skin, you can use purple, violet and blue-violet colors, or even blue if you want. And that way shadows will look more natural. And when you think about it, it makes sense, because when you get a shadow over something, it kind of removes all the vibrancy, or not all of it, but some vibrancy and saturation. So by using these colors on the skin, or when you're shading skin, you can achieve a more realistic looking shadow. Before I learned this, and I still do this, I used to just use a darker shade of the colors I were using to color the skin. So for instance, you can still see me do it here. I might use like E21, and that's from the color family E. So I use the very lightest shade for the like base color, and then I add the darker colors from the same family. But then to really make shadows pop, you can add these purple and violet shades. What I did before I learned this could sometimes make the skin just look like sunburnt, or as if you would have applied bronzer or makeup, And that's not so strange, because when you just add a color, a darker shade from the same family, it might also be more vibrant. And so it doesn't really look like a shadow, but more like, as I said, makeup. Because just choosing a darker shade can sometimes make it look more vibrant and saturated. And shadows aren't really saturated or vibrant. So that's something to think about when you're picking your colors for shadows. Of course, another thing that really helps is really studying the subject that you are drawing or coloring, and then try to figure out what kind of shading that will work the best for your subject. And in this case, it's easy for me because I have this reference photo of Yuna and Tidus, so I can kind of get the feel for what colors I should choose. But then again, you can't really make a perfect copy of the colors, so there's still some work to do, like figuring out, will this shade of violet be too vibrant perhaps, or is that a style I want to pursue? So there is quite a lot to think about when you're picking out colors, but it really helps you. So I'd say that it's always worth it to spend some extra time to study your subject, try out your colors and make sure that they really work together before you start coloring. What I also had to pay attention to when making this piece was if there was any kind of undertone in the skin or on the hair. And by that I mean there might be a light that falls on the hair and perhaps creates a yellow kind of glow to it. And the same goes for skin. So I tried to see, and I really study the original image really well and try to see, is there some hint of yellow here? Is there perhaps, is the shadow more red? What is the lightest color of the hair? Such things. What you also learn by studying the subject you're drawing is that most often the darkest shadow will be next to the very brightest part of something. So like if you look at Yuna's cheek, you will see that on the right side I have added some, I think it's blue violet. And that's because I want to emphasize the shadow there. In that way, the brightest part and the darkest part will really be contrasted, and that might also make it look more natural. And it's really the same principle for the hair. As you saw earlier when I was coloring Tidus' hair, I actually used a very dark neutral grey color for all the shadows in his hair. And it might be a little scary to pick up such a dark color when as you can see I've used such a bright and almost like apricot color. But this is really what makes shadows and shape look more natural and realistic. However, when you're using Copic markers, or I believe most alcohol-based markers, sometimes it really doesn't work out using so many different layers of color. And with this paper that I'm drawing on, it works so well. But if you would be using Copic's own marker paper that I have on like a pad, if I layer too many colors on, it will sit on top of each other, and it only does this a little on this paper if I use really dark colors. So for instance, when I was coloring Yuna's hair, when I used the very darkest brown, if you hold the drawing up to the light, it will kind of be like not glittery but very shiny. So I believe if I would have used an eraser on it, it might have actually rubbed off the color. And that is what happens if you use a thinner paper that can't really absorb all these colors. As you can see, I am drawing in my sketchbook that I bought a year ago. and this is a crescent Rendr no show-through sketchbook, and it works really well with Copics, and it works really well for me because I really like layering and like slowly rendering out shapes, shadows and light. And layering is really what I think is fun with the coloring and blending too. And that's what I tend to do with most of my drawings. I try to blend colors and mix in color families, and that's quite exciting, and I believe it gives a very different feel to the overall drawing. And now that you see me coloring the white clothes of Yuna, you can see that I try to use, or I'm trying to find the undertones of the clothes. So instead of just adding gray colors to like render the shadows, I use some blue and I use violet, and I mix my gray colors. So when you're using Copic markers, there are what are they called? Toned grays. I don't own those. Then we have warm grays, and I used some of those for her white clothing. And then you have the neutral gray and the cool grays, and they give off different looks. So the cool grays will kind of go to the blue colors and make the shadow look a little more like cold, so as if you had a shadow on you while being outside when it's dark and without the sun, while the warm grays can sometimes give a different feeling of what kind of fabric you're coloring, or that the shadow is affected by sunlight. And in this case, her clothing kind of was, because from the right side you had this more violet and cold light, while from the left side there was a more warm light. You will start noticing, if you start studying shadows, that most shadows that fall on something that is white is actually not just black or gray. It actually has some color in it, and that of course depends on like if you're outside or if you're inside, what kind of lighting you have. But anything that is white will look more realistic, at least according to myself, if you try to find the undertones of the shadows and try to add that in your shades. Mixing in more vibrant colors in my shadows was something I learned by looking at a lot of digital art, actually. You can sometimes see in digital art that they mixed in a very vibrant color, but that is different, like in the eyes or in some shadows, and I think it makes the picture or the drawing look more cool, and it's more interesting to look at if you blend in some colors that you don't really expect to be there. So to get more interesting looking shadows in this piece, you can see that I, for the white parts at least, I always started with adding a very light blue color and a very light violet color. Later on you will also see me be using some very bright yellow color, because from the left side in this in the original picture there was some warm light coming from the left, so I wanted to recreate this by adding a little bit of yellow. And because this paper is so great, you can add that in afterwards, and it kind of blends out evenly with the rest of the colors that I have already laid down. Oh, and by the way, can you guess which part of this drawing that was the hardest for me to draw? Just think about that for a little while and see if you can figure it out. So, the most difficult part for me to draw, not color, but draw, was Tidus' arm, the one with the black glove. I had such a hard time to make this look right. You can see that I have tried to like find out the shape of that one bone in the arm, and I think that's the place where I erased the most when I made this drawing. You never really think about it, but the lower part of the arm is kind of complex with the elbow and the bones, and since he's like, I don't know, tilting his hand a little, I had to figure out like where does the bone begin and end, and how would the shadows fall on it. And it was good that I had the original reference photo for so that I could be guided in doing this. And in the end, I'm happy with it. But yeah, that was the part that I spent most time on. After I had uploaded this finished piece to DeviantArt, I was asked if I could do a similar piece but with Kairi and Sora from Kingdom Hearts. And we were discussing like what Kingdom Hearts game that I would pick for the main designs, because the characters' designs, you know, shifts from game to game. And the person that requested this fan art suggested I do the fan art of the designs from Kingdom Hearts 3. But I haven't played that one yet, and both that person and I were convinced that I should play the game before I make that drawing. I'm very curious to see what happens in the game, and once I have played it, I think I would like to do a Kingdom Hearts fan art. And I'm curious to hear like if you have played the game and if there is a specific scene that you would like me to recreate, or preferably a scene from the older games that I have played. So I've only played the first and second one, but if you have a scene that you really like from those games, I would really like to see them, and then perhaps plan some fan arts for the future. But anyways, back to the drawing at hand. Right now in the video I am coloring Tidus's gloves, and one of them I imagined were made out of brass. And to achieve the look of brass, I mixed some yellow colors and actually a yellow-green color. And that's an example of when it works really well to mix between color families. So the brightest tone, or the brightest color that I used, I believe was Y000 for the very brightest parts, and then Y15, Y26 and YG91 as the yellow-green color. I use different techniques to make sure the colors blend well, and generally it's a good idea to use the colorless blender from Copic, because it contains actually transparent ink, but it makes the surface wet, and it also makes it easier for colors to blend, because mixing more dry colors is extremely difficult. It can be done also with a colorless blender, but it's much easier to just have it wet from the beginning. Most of the time I use the brush and nib of the Copic marker, and it can be used to blend more easily. So what I do is I press down the brush nib and let it stay for a while, and then I just quickly make a stroke on the paper, and that way I begin with a more saturated and like more concentrated ink in one place, but as I drag it out and do it quickly, it becomes less and less saturated, and I get less and less ink. So if I start from the other side and do the same thing, the two colors that I'm mixing will meet, and then I can keep doing that until I feel like the colors have mixed evenly. And that technique isn't always necessary if you're coloring a very small area, like you can see now in the video. Then it's more important to let one color dry a bit before you add the next color, otherwise you might just get them to be too blended in a way, if that makes sense. And then you can't really see a contrast between the two. And you do want to see a contrast, but you don't want it to be too heavy. So small areas requires you to have some patience and wait until you start blending, while the larger areas are a real challenge, because sometimes you have to be quick, and you have to think about how long you're keeping the marker on the paper, because as I said before, the longer you let the nib stay on the paper, the more ink it will let go of. So you have to learn, or you have to get to know the paper you're using, and by doing so you will learn how to make your colors look more even. In general, I experience that brighter colors are easier to blend and easier to work with, while the darker colors are a little more difficult to blend. So one way of getting around this is to go over with the same colors twice, and that will make it look a little more even. For the background of this drawing, I'm also using a different strategy, where I have my base color and it's all dry, and then I go over with the darker color for a shade, and as I said, I drag it out so that the end of the darker color is pretty bright. And then I imagine I use the brighter color to keep pushing where I left off with darker, and just try to drag the color out and blend in that way. And I also do that for Yuna's skirt, as you can see here. But at the same time, I also wanted to keep some shadows look kind of sharp, so that they create a sharp line between the brightest part and the darkest part. And that's because I wanted to create the look of folds in Yuna's skirt. What I do to create sharper shadows is I let the brightest color dry completely, and then I fix the shadows in the way I normally do. In that way I will have a sharp line between the shadow and the bright part. An interesting thing about Copic marker ink is that if you go over the same color several times, the color will get darker even though you didn't change the color. And that's something I do to emphasize shadows, and I basically find a place where I want the shadow to pop more than it does, and I simply just go over it with the same color again. And there's not really any need to blend it more at that point. You can just add it and see what effect you get. And now we have reached the point where I make a mistake with the colors. I initially thought that a violet color that is more towards the red or warm violet would blend very well with a blue violet color, but that was not the case, as you can see. So if these colors would have been much brighter, it would have been more easy to blend them. But since there's actually quite a difference in brightness between the two, like the first violet I used was pretty dark, and then I added this warmer violet that was very bright in comparison, and that made it quite not work. This mainly becomes a problem when you're coloring larger areas. If this would have been a smaller area, it probably wouldn't have been sticking out as it does right now. But then again, if you go over it several times with the color that actually works, you can kind of mute the colors and it will look better. For this part here instead, I just used the blue-violet family instead of mixing it with a brighter violet, in order to make sure that the colors blended more evenly. But here comes the biggest challenge, and that is blending colors over such a large area that this part is. Copic markers have two different nibs. They have one chisel tip and one brush tip. And sometimes it's easier to color larger areas with a chisel tip instead of the brush nib, as I'm doing here. At least if you want to have a very even coloration. But that gets way more difficult when you're using the brush nib, because as you can see the brush nib is so small compared to the area that I need to color. And because of that you will end up seeing brush stroke marks. But you can also fix this by just going over with the same color twice or more. And so the brush marks won't show as much as they do first. Copic offers a specific kind of marker that is called wide marker, and they only have the chisel nib. But the area that they can cover when you color is so much greater. So I believe if there is a color that you use very often for like coloring the blue sky, for instance, then it can actually be worth it investing in those broad or wide markers, since they really make coloring larger areas much easier on you, and you won't have to struggle as much to achieve an even coloration. At this point in the drawing I started thinking about the theme colors of Final Fantasy X, and I just realized then that all the colors that I used in this drawing, and the original picture of course, really contain all of the theme colors from Final Fantasy X. So we have the violet and purple, and that very warm kind of yellow. And if you bring up the Final Fantasy X logo for the game, you will see that all of those colors are in this drawing. And that's probably one of the reasons that I had a lot of fun coloring this drawing, and also why I picked it out in the first place. Because I somehow really like the combination of purple or violet, yellow and red. Violet and yellow are also two colors that are heavily featured in One Shot. And I think that is also a reason why I have done so many one-shot fan arts. It's not only that I like the design, but also that I really like the color combinations. And now, dear friends, we are getting close to the end of this video. This drawing has truly been a pretty long project, but it's been a really fun one. I really enjoy making these scenes from the different Final Fantasy games, and since I have kept them all in my sketchbook, I imagine that my sketchbook will at one point almost become like a small fan book of both One Shot and Final Fantasy and some other games as well. This video has been really long as well, and I am extremely happy that you stayed for so long and that you had the patience to sit it through with me and listening to me while I color. I feel as if I learn so much by filming what I do and sharing it with you, because it gives me a huge amount of motivation to get better at what I do. The next video I will be going to make will be the one where we celebrate my 1 year here on YouTube and on Etsy. And for that video I'm going to do a sketchbook flip through and show you some of the other artworks that I'm very happy with and that I've done this past year. So I really hope I will be seeing you for that next video as well. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, I would be very happy to see you give it a thumbs up. It really helps me out. You can see more of what I do on Instagram. I am the most active there, and most of the time I post process photos of what I'm working on, so that's also a way of getting to know what I'm doing. If you have any suggestions or requests of what you would like to see me do next, you can comment that in the comment section below, or reach out to me on Instagram or on Twitter. So enjoy these last moments of this video with some music, and make sure to have a great day today, and I will see you soon. Bye!